Sarah walked into the grand music hall with her backpack hanging loosely from one shoulder. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. She had never been inside a place like this before. The walls were lined with portraits of famous composers, and the air smelled faintly of old wood and fresh polish. She wasn't supposed to be here at all. Her mother had signed her up for piano lessons without asking her first. Sarah was a quiet girl who preferred numbers and puzzles to music and art. While other kids her age were listening to pop songs and learning instruments, Sarah spent her free time solving complex math problems she found online. She loved the way numbers made sense, how they followed rules that never changed. Professor Margaret Holloway stood at the front of the room, arranging sheet music on the grand piano. She was a tall woman in her late 50s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her reputation preceded her. Professor Holloway had taught at the conservatory for over 30 years and had trained some of the finest pianists in the country. She was known for being strict, demanding, and utterly uncompromising when it came to musical excellence. Sarah approached slowly, her sneakers squeaking slightly on the floor. Professor Holloway looked up, her sharp blue eyes scanning the girl from head to toe. She saw a thin teenager with messy brown hair, glasses slightly crooked on her nose, and an expression that suggested she would rather be anywhere else in the world. The professor had seen many reluctant students over the years. Parents who forced their children into lessons hoping to create the next Mozart or Beethoven. Most of them quit within months. She could already tell this girl would be no different. There was no spark in her eyes when she looked at the piano, no excitement or curiosity, just resignation. Sarah sat down on the piano bench, placing her hands awkwardly on the keys. Professor Holloway began with the basics, showing her the proper hand position and explaining the layout of the keyboard. Sarah listened politely but seemed distant, as if her mind was somewhere else entirely. The lesson continued for 30 minutes. Professor Holloway demonstrated simple scales and asked Sarah to repeat them. The girl's fingers moved stiffly across the keys, producing sounds that were technically correct but completely lifeless. There was no feeling, no musicality. It was like watching a robot perform calculations. As the lesson drew to a close, Professor Holloway felt a familiar disappointment settling in her chest. Another talented slot wasted on someone who didn't care about music. But then she noticed something odd. While Sarah's playing was mechanical, her eyes kept drifting to the sheet music in a peculiar way. She wasn't reading the notes like a musician would. Instead, she seemed to be analyzing the patterns, the spacing, the mathematical relationships between the notes. An idea began to form in Professor Holloway's mind. It was mischievous, perhaps even a bit cruel, but she was curious. She wanted to test something about this strange, detached girl who looked at music like it was a math problem. The professor reached over and deliberately adjusted one of the piano strings inside the instrument. It was a subtle change that would cause a single note to sound slightly off pitch. To most beginning students, it would be completely unnoticeable. Even intermediate players might struggle to identify the problem without careful listening. She closed the piano lid and smiled at Sarah with a look that seemed almost challenging. The girl gathered her things, said a quiet goodbye, and left without any indication that she had noticed anything unusual. Professor Holloway sat alone in the empty music hall, wondering if her little test would reveal anything interesting. She doubted it. The girl seemed completely tone-deaf to the beauty of music. But something about the way Sarah had looked at those sheets of music made the professor pause. There was intelligence there, just not the kind she was used to seeing in her students. Over the next week, Sarah returned for her scheduled lessons. Each time she performed the assigned exercises with the same mechanical precision. Her fingers hit the right keys at the right times, but there was no soul in the music. Professor Holloway continued her test, leaving the one string deliberately out of tune. What the professor didn't know was that Sarah had noticed the problem immediately during that first lesson. She had heard the dissonance, not through any musical training, but because her brain processed sounds as mathematical frequencies. To Sarah, the out-of-tune note created an asymmetry in the pattern, like an equation that didn't balance properly. But Sarah said nothing. She was used to adults not taking her seriously, used to being underestimated. If the professor wanted to play games, Sarah could play too. She would wait and see where this strange little test was heading. The music hall continued to fill with the sound of imperfect scales and lifeless melodies, while two very different minds circled each other, each trying to figure out what the other was really thinking. Neither one realized yet that this unusual dynamic would lead to something neither of them expected. 3 weeks passed, and Sarah continued attending her piano lessons with the same quiet compliance. She never complained, never showed any enthusiasm, and never mentioned the out-of-tune note that continued to plague the otherwise beautiful grand piano. Professor Holloway found herself growing increasingly frustrated with the situation. During their 5th lesson, the professor decided to push things further. She gave Sarah a piece by Bach, a simple prelude that most beginners could handle with a few weeks of practice. The piece was built on mathematical patterns and repetition, which the professor thought might at least hold Sarah's interest. Sarah took the sheet music home and returned the following week. When she sat down to play, Professor Holloway was genuinely surprised. The girl played the entire piece from memory without a single mistake. Every note was in the correct place, every timing was precise. But it still sounded hollow and emotionless, like a computer-generated playback. The professor leaned forward in her chair. Something was happening here that she didn't quite understand. Most students who could memorize a Bach prelude in 1 week showed at least some passion for the music. But Sarah played it like she was reciting a multiplication table. During a break, Professor Holloway asked Sarah a direct question that had been bothering her for weeks. Why did she keep coming to lessons if she clearly had no interest in music? Sarah looked up from the piano, her expression unreadable behind her crooked glasses. The answer was simple and honest. Her mother wanted her to learn piano. Her mother believed that music would help Sarah become more well-rounded, more social, more normal. Sarah didn't have the heart to refuse because her mother worried about her so much. She knew her mother saw her obsession with mathematics as something odd, something that needed to be balanced with other activities. Professor Holloway felt a pang of sympathy mixed with irritation. Here was a girl going through the motions to please someone else, wasting both of their time. The professor had devoted her entire life to music, and it hurt to see someone treat it as nothing more than an obligation. But then Sarah asked a question that caught the professor completely off guard. She wanted to know why the composer had chosen to repeat certain patterns in specific intervals. What was the mathematical reasoning behind the structure of the piece? Why did some progressions feel resolved while others felt incomplete? Professor Holloway blinked in surprise. In 30 years of teaching, no student had ever asked her questions like that. They asked about finger positions, about timing, about expression and emotion, but never about the mathematical architecture underlying the composition. The professor found herself explaining music theory in a way she had never done before. She talked about frequency ratios, about how musical intervals corresponded to mathematical relationships. She explained that an octave represented a frequency ratio of 2 to 1, that a perfect fifth was 3 to 2. She showed Sarah how Bach had built his compositions using mathematical sequences and patterns. For the first time since lessons began, Sarah's eyes lit up with genuine interest. She leaned forward, asking more questions, making connections that even the professor hadn't fully considered before. Sarah began to see music not as sounds and emotions, but as a complex system of numerical relationships playing out in time. Professor Holloway felt something shift inside her. This wasn't a typical student, and maybe that was perfectly fine. Perhaps there were different ways to appreciate and understand music. Maybe the traditional path of emotion and feeling wasn't the only valid approach. That evening, Sarah went home and did something unusual. She pulled out graph paper and began mapping out the Bach prelude as a series of mathematical equations. She calculated frequency ratios, plotted wave patterns, and analyzed the structural symmetries in the composition. It was the most interested she had ever been in anything related to music. The next lesson, Sarah arrived early. She had her graph paper with her and showed Professor Holloway what she had created. The professor stared at the pages covered in numbers and diagrams. It was music transformed into pure mathematics, and it was absolutely brilliant. Professor Holloway realized she had been testing Sarah all this time with the out-of-tune piano string, waiting for the girl to reveal some hidden musical talent. But she had been looking for the wrong thing. Sarah's talent wasn't musical in the traditional sense. It was something entirely different and potentially far more rare. The professor made a decision. She would stop trying to turn Sarah into a typical piano student. Instead, she would embrace this unique perspective and see where it led. But first she needed to know something. She asked Sarah directly if she had noticed anything wrong with the piano. The room fell silent. Sarah looked at the instrument, then at the professor, trying to decide how to respond. The game they had been playing for weeks hung in the balance. Finally, Sarah spoke. She told the professor that the G above middle C had been out of tune since the very first lesson. The frequency was approximately 8 cents flat, creating a dissonance when played with other notes. She had noticed immediately but assumed the professor knew and would fix it eventually. Professor Holloway sat back in her chair, stunned. This girl with no musical training had identified the exact problem with perfect accuracy. She hadn't heard it with a musician's ear. She had calculated it with a mathematician's mind. The professor stood up, walked to the piano, and opened the lid. She tuned the string properly, then closed it again. When she turned back to Sarah, there was a new expression on her face. Not disappointment or frustration, but genuine curiosity and respect. She told Sarah that they were going to approach lessons differently from now on. They would explore the mathematical foundations of music together. But she had one condition. Sarah had to promise to try to feel the music as well as understand it. Numbers and equations were beautiful, but they were only part of the story. Sarah agreed, though she wasn't sure she could keep that promise. She had spent her whole life understanding the world through logic and patterns. Feelings were messy and unpredictable, but something about the professor's challenge intrigued her. As Sarah left that day, both she and Professor Holloway felt something had changed between them. A wall had come down, replaced by a strange new partnership neither of them had expected to find. The following weeks transformed the dynamic between Sarah and Professor Holloway completely. The music hall became less like a traditional classroom and more like a laboratory where mathematics and music collided in fascinating ways. The professor brought in books about music theory, acoustics, and the physics of sound. Sarah devoured them with an enthusiasm she had never shown for the actual playing of music. Professor Holloway started giving Sarah unusual assignments. Instead of practicing scales and simple songs, Sarah was asked to analyze complex compositions and identify their mathematical patterns. She would spend hours at home creating charts and graphs that mapped out the structure of symphonies and concertos. Her bedroom walls became covered with papers showing frequency distributions and harmonic progressions. Sarah's mother noticed the change immediately. Her daughter was finally engaged with the piano lessons, even if not in the way she had hoped. Sarah talked constantly about ratios and wave patterns and something called the circle of fifths. Her mother didn't understand most of it, but she was happy to see her daughter excited about something that connected her to the world of arts and culture, even if only tangentially. At school, Sarah remained the quiet math genius that everyone knew but few understood. Her classmates found her odd. She never joined in conversations about music or movies or social media. During lunch, she sat alone working on problems that looked like hieroglyphics to everyone else. But now she had something new to think about, a bridge between the numbers she loved and the creative world she had always felt excluded from. Professor Holloway began to see her own field through completely new eyes. She had taught music for decades using the traditional methods passed down through generations of teachers, but Sarah's questions forced her to think more deeply about why music worked the way it did. Why did certain chord progressions feel satisfying? Why did minor keys sound sad while major keys sounded happy? What was the mathematical basis for all of it? One afternoon, Sarah made a discovery that would change everything. She was analyzing a Beethoven sonata when she noticed something unusual in the frequency patterns. There was a mathematical relationship hidden in the composition that she had never seen described in any of the books the professor had given her. It was a complex ratio that appeared repeatedly throughout the piece, creating a subtle unity that most listeners would feel, but never consciously recognize. Sarah spent 3 days working on the problem, filling notebook after notebook with calculations. She cross-referenced the pattern with other Beethoven works and found it appearing again and again. Then she expanded her search to other composers and discovered variations of the same mathematical principle showing up across centuries of music. She brought her findings to Professor Holloway during their next lesson. The professor spent an hour reviewing Sarah's work, her expression growing more amazed with each page. What Sarah had discovered was a previously unidentified mathematical principle that many great composers had intuitively used without ever formally recognizing it. Professor Holloway contacted colleagues at universities, sending them copies of Sarah's analysis. The responses came back quickly and were unanimously impressed. This was original research, the kind that PhD students struggled to produce, and it had been done by a 16-year-old girl who supposedly couldn't carry a tune. The professor sat Sarah down for a serious conversation. She told the girl that she had a genuine gift, not for music in the traditional sense, but for understanding its mathematical foundations. This was a rare talent that could lead to important work in fields like acoustic engineering, music theory research, or even artificial intelligence applications in music composition. Sarah listened quietly, processing this information. She had never thought of herself as particularly special. She was just a girl who liked math and happened to be taking piano lessons. The idea that her way of seeing things could be valuable was strange and a little frightening. But Professor Holloway wasn't finished. She explained that while Sarah's analytical abilities were extraordinary, she was missing something crucial. All the mathematical understanding in the world couldn't replace the emotional experience of music. Numbers could describe music, but they couldn't capture why a piece of music made people cry, or feel joy, or remember lost moments from their past. The professor gave Sarah a new challenge. She wanted her to pick one simple piece, something short and uncomplicated, and learn to play it with feeling. Not just hitting the right notes at the right time, but actually trying to express something emotional through the music. Sarah could analyze it mathematically all she wanted, but she also had to try to feel it. Sarah chose a piece by Eric Satie called Gymnopédie No. 1. It was slow and melancholic, with a simple structure that wouldn't be technically difficult. She took the sheet music home and began her usual process of analysis. She mapped out the harmonic progressions, identified the frequency relationships, and created diagrams showing how the piece was constructed. But then she did something different. She closed all her notebooks and just listened to recordings of the piece. She sat in her room with her eyes closed, letting the music wash over her without trying to understand or categorize it. It felt uncomfortable at first, like she was wasting time that could be spent on something productive. But gradually something began to happen. Sarah noticed that the music made her feel something she couldn't quite name. It was melancholic but also peaceful, like standing alone at a window watching rain fall on an empty street. There was beauty in its sadness, a kind of gentle acceptance of loneliness that resonated with her in unexpected ways. She realized that this was what Professor Holloway had been talking about. The mathematics could explain how the piece was built, but they couldn't explain why it touched something deep inside her. That required a different kind of understanding, one that made her uncomfortable because it couldn't be measured or calculated. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah practiced the piece obsessively. She worked on her technique, trying to make her fingers produce sounds that matched the feeling she had experienced while listening. It was harder than any math problem she had ever solved because there was no right answer, no way to check if she was doing it correctly. Professor Holloway watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction. Sarah was still analytical and precise in her approach, but something new was emerging. The girl was beginning to understand that intellect and emotion weren't opposites, but rather different ways of experiencing the same reality. The day came for Sarah to perform the Gymnopédie for her professor. She sat at the piano, her hands trembling slightly with nervousness. She had never cared before whether her playing was good or bad, but now it mattered to her. She wanted to communicate something real through the music. She began to play, and Professor Holloway immediately heard the difference. The notes were still precisely placed, the timing still accurate, but there was something else there now. A vulnerability, a genuine attempt to express feeling through sound. It wasn't perfect. Sarah still had the habits of a mechanical player, but the seed of something real had been planted. When the piece ended, Sarah looked up at the professor with anxious eyes, waiting for judgment. Professor Holloway smiled in a way that was both proud and a little sad. She recognized that look on Sarah's face. It was the expression of someone who had discovered that the world was bigger and more complicated than they had previously understood. Word of Sarah's mathematical discoveries about music began to spread beyond Professor Holloway's circle of colleagues. A professor from the State University's mathematics department reached out, asking to meet with Sarah. Dr. Chen was a specialist in applied mathematics and had been searching for someone to help with a research project combining music, theory, and advanced mathematical modeling. Sarah's mother was overwhelmed when Professor Holloway called to explain the situation. Her daughter, who she had enrolled in piano lessons hoping to help her become more social and well-rounded, had somehow become a subject of academic interest. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. The meeting with Dr. Chen took place in a cramped university office filled with whiteboards covered in equations. Sarah felt more comfortable here than she ever had in the grand music hall. This was her natural environment where numbers ruled and everything made logical sense. Dr. Chen explained his project. He was working on creating algorithms that could analyze historical music to predict patterns in composition. The applications ranged from helping music historians authenticate disputed works to assisting modern composers in understanding the mathematical principles behind great music. He needed someone who understood both the mathematics and the musical theory, and apparently Sarah was uniquely qualified. Sarah listened with growing excitement. This was exactly the kind of problem she loved. Complex, analytical, with clear parameters and measurable outcomes. She agreed immediately to join the project as a research assistant. Professor Holloway, who had accompanied Sarah to the meeting, felt a mixture of pride and concern. Over the following months, Sarah's life took on a strange, dual nature. 3 times a week she still came to the music hall for her lessons with Professor Holloway. But now she also spent hours at the university working with Dr. Chen's team. She was the youngest person in the lab by almost a decade, but her contributions quickly proved invaluable. The research team was amazed by Sarah's ability to identify patterns that their computer algorithms had missed. She could look at a musical score and immediately spot mathematical relationships that would take their programs hours to calculate. Her brain processed musical information in ways that were both intuitive and rigorously logical. But Professor Holloway noticed something troubling. As Sarah became more involved with the university research, she began to neglect the emotional side of music that they had been working on together. Sarah stopped trying to play with feeling and returned to her mechanical, calculation-based approach. The brief glimpse of vulnerability that had appeared during the gymnopédie performance seemed to have vanished. During one lesson, Professor Holloway confronted Sarah about this regression. She asked why Sarah had stopped trying to connect emotionally with the music. Sarah's response was honest and a bit defensive. She explained that emotions were messy and subjective. In the research lab, her value came from her analytical precision. Adding emotions into the mix would only muddy the waters and make her work less reliable. Professor Holloway felt frustrated, but held her tongue. She recognized that Sarah was retreating to what felt safe and comfortable. The girl had been asked to venture into unfamiliar emotional territory, and it had made her vulnerable. Now, given the choice between the certainty of mathematics and the uncertainty of feelings, Sarah was choosing what she knew best. The professor decided to take a different approach. She invited Sarah to attend a concert with her. It was a performance by a famous pianist playing Chopin's nocturnes. Sarah agreed reluctantly, viewing it as an obligation rather than an opportunity. They sat in the darkened concert hall among hundreds of other audience members. When the pianist began to play, Sarah initially tried to analyze what she was hearing. She identified chord progressions, calculated frequency ratios, and mentally mapped the mathematical structure of the pieces. But Professor Holloway had anticipated this. She leaned over and whispered to Sarah to close her eyes and just listen. No analysis, no calculations, just pure listening. Sarah resisted at first, but eventually complied. With her eyes closed and her analytical mind deliberately quieted, something unexpected happened. The music seemed to bypass her conscious thoughts and speak directly to something deeper. She felt the loneliness in the nocturnes, the yearning in the melodies, the bittersweet quality of beauty mixed with sadness. For the first time in her life, Sarah understood why people cared so much about music. It wasn't about the notes or the technical skill. It was about the emotional experience that those elements created together. When the concert ended, Sarah sat in silence for a long moment. Professor Holloway didn't say anything, letting the experience settle in the girl's mind. As they walked out into the cool evening air, Sarah finally spoke. She admitted that she had felt something during the performance that she couldn't explain mathematically. It scared her a little. Professor Holloway smiled gently and told Sarah that fear was a normal response to genuine emotion. Most people spent their lives trying to avoid feelings that made them uncomfortable, but those feelings were also what made life worth living. Music, at its best, helped people access emotions they might otherwise never experience. The conversation continued as they walked through the city streets. Sarah asked questions she had never thought to ask before. How did composers translate their emotions into music? Why did certain combinations of notes produce specific feelings? Was there any mathematical basis for emotional responses to music? Or was it all subjective? Professor Holloway answered as best she could, but she also admitted that some questions didn't have clear answers. The relationship between music and emotion was one of the great mysteries of human experience. Science could explain some of it, but not all. There was room for both understanding and wonder. Back at the university lab, Sarah found herself approaching her research differently. She still performed the same analytical tasks, but now she tried to consider the emotional intentions behind the compositions she was studying. Why had Mozart chosen this progression instead of another mathematically similar option? What feeling was Beethoven trying to evoke with this particular sequence? Dr. Chen noticed the change in Sarah's work and was initially concerned that she was losing her analytical edge. But then he realized that her insights were actually becoming more accurate. By considering the emotional dimension alongside the mathematical one, Sarah was developing a more complete understanding of how great music worked. One evening, Sarah made another breakthrough. She was analyzing a disputed composition that some scholars attributed to Bach, while others believed it was written by one of his students. The mathematical analysis had been inconclusive, with the piece showing characteristics that could support either attribution. But Sarah approached it from a new angle. She considered not just the mathematical patterns, but also the emotional arc of the piece. She analyzed how the composition built tension and released it, how it played with listener expectations, how it created moments of beauty and resolution. Then she compared this emotional architecture to confirmed works by Bach and by his various students. The results were striking. The emotional structure of the disputed piece matched Bach's confirmed works with remarkable consistency. It showed the same sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate listener emotions that characterized Bach's greatest compositions. The students' works, while technically similar, lacked this deeper emotional intelligence. Sarah presented her findings to Dr. Chen, who was astounded. She had found a way to combine analytical rigor with emotional understanding, to solve a problem that had stumped scholars for decades. This was exactly the kind of breakthrough the project had been hoping for. Professor Holloway heard about Sarah's success through the academic grapevine. She invited Sarah to come by the music hall outside of their regular lesson time. When Sarah arrived, the professor was sitting at the piano with a thoughtful expression. The professor told Sarah that she had been wrong about something. When Sarah first came to lessons months ago, Professor Holloway had thought the girl had no musical talent whatsoever. She had set up the test with the out-of-tune piano expecting Sarah to fail, to prove that she didn't belong in a music classroom. But now the professor understood that she had been looking for the wrong kind of talent. Sarah's genius wasn't in playing music the traditional way. It was in understanding music at a level that combined rigorous mathematical analysis with genuine emotional intelligence. That combination was far rarer than simple technical skill at an instrument. Sarah felt something shift inside her at these words. For so long, she had felt like she was failing at music because she couldn't play with the natural emotion that seemed to come easily to others. But maybe she had been succeeding all along, just in a different way than anyone expected. Professor Holloway stood up from the piano and offered Sarah her hand in a formal gesture. She told Sarah that while she would always be welcome to continue lessons, the professor no longer had much to teach her. Sarah had found her own unique path through the world of music, one that honored both her analytical mind and her growing emotional awareness. Sarah decided to continue her lessons with Professor Holloway, despite the professor's protests. Their relationship had evolved into something more than teacher and student. They had become collaborators exploring the intersection of mathematics and music together. Each lesson now felt more like a research session where both of them learned something new. The university research project was expanding rapidly. Dr. Chen had secured additional funding based on Sarah's breakthrough with the disputed Bach composition. Major music foundations and technology companies were interested in the work they were doing. Sarah found herself participating in conference calls with scholars and executives who were decades older than her, all eager to hear her unique perspective. At school, Sarah remained largely invisible to her classmates. They knew she was involved in some kind of special research project, but nobody really understood what it meant. A few teachers mentioned her work during announcements, praising her achievements, but this only made Sarah more of an outsider. She didn't mind much. She had never fit in with her peers anyway, and now she had found a community at the university where her way of thinking was valued. Her mother watched these developments with mixed emotions. On one hand, she was incredibly proud of her daughter's accomplishments. Sarah was doing work that impressed university professors and attracting attention from important organizations. On the other hand, she worried that Sarah was becoming even more isolated from normal teenage experiences. Her daughter spent all her free time either at the music hall, the university lab, or working alone in her room. One Saturday afternoon, Sarah's mother sat her down for a conversation. She asked Sarah if she was happy. It was a simple question, but Sarah found it surprisingly difficult to answer. Was she happy? She enjoyed her work and found satisfaction in solving complex problems. But happiness seemed like something different, something she wasn't sure she had ever really experienced. Sarah tried to explain to her mother that happiness might not be the right goal for someone like her. She was content with her work and grateful for the opportunities she had been given. Maybe that was enough. Her mother looked sad at this response but didn't push further. The next week at the music hall, Professor Holloway noticed that Sarah seemed distracted. When pressed, Sarah shared the conversation she had had with her mother. The professor listened thoughtfully, then told Sarah a story about her own life. Professor Holloway had devoted herself entirely to music from a young age. She practiced for hours every day, won competitions, performed in prestigious venues. Her talent was recognized by everyone, and she was told repeatedly that she was destined for greatness. But by her late 20s, she realized that all this success hadn't made her happy. She had achieved everything she was supposed to want, but something felt missing. Eventually, Professor Holloway discovered that her true joy came not from performing, but from teaching and exploring the theoretical aspects of music. She gave up her performance career to work at the conservatory, a decision that shocked and disappointed many people who had believed in her. But it was the right choice for her, even if it meant giving up fame and prestige. The professor told Sarah that happiness wasn't about doing what others expected or following a traditional path. It was about finding work that engaged both your mind and your heart. Sarah had the opportunity to create something genuinely new in the world, combining mathematics and music in ways that had never been done before. That was worth pursuing, even if it meant being different from everyone else. Sarah felt something release inside her chest. She realized she had been carrying guilt about not being the daughter her mother wanted, not being the typical student Professor Holloway had expected, not being like her normal classmates. But maybe being different wasn't something to apologize for. Back at the university lab, the research team was preparing for a major presentation. They had been invited to demonstrate their work at an international symposium on music theory and technology. Sarah would be presenting her findings on emotional analysis in classical compositions. It would be her first time speaking in front of a large academic audience. The weeks leading up to the symposium were intense. Sarah worked with Dr. Chen to refine her presentation, making sure the mathematics was rigorous while keeping the concepts accessible to an audience that included both scientists and musicians. Professor Holloway helped her prepare by making her explain complex ideas in simple terms, a skill that didn't come naturally to Sarah. The night before the presentation, Sarah barely slept. She kept running through her speech in her mind, worried about all the things that could go wrong. What if the experts in the audience found flaws in her reasoning? What if she couldn't answer their questions? What if she proved that she was just a kid pretending to understand things beyond her capability? Professor Holloway met Sarah for breakfast the morning of the symposium. She could see the fear in the girl's eyes and recognized it immediately. She had felt that same terror before her own first major performance decades ago. The professor told Sarah something that had been told to her long ago. Fear meant that you cared about doing well, and caring was the first step toward excellence. The symposium was held in a large auditorium filled with hundreds of attendees. Sarah stood backstage, listening to the other presenters through a speaker. They were all accomplished scholars with impressive credentials and years of experience. Sarah was just a teenager who had stumbled into this world almost by accident. When her turn came, Sarah walked onto the stage with trembling legs. The bright lights made it hard to see the audience, which was both terrifying and comforting. She began her presentation, her voice shaky at first but growing stronger as she moved through her material. She explained her discovery about emotional architecture in classical music, showing how mathematical analysis could reveal patterns and how composers manipulated listener feelings. She presented her work on the disputed Bach composition, demonstrating how combining analytical rigor with emotional intelligence led to more accurate conclusions than either approach alone. As Sarah spoke, something interesting happened. She forgot to be nervous. The material was so fascinating to her, the pattern so clear and beautiful that her enthusiasm overtook her fear. She began speaking more naturally, making eye contact with audience members, even smiling when describing particularly elegant mathematical relationships. The presentation ended with a complex visualization showing emotional patterns across multiple Bach compositions. The audience sat in silence for a moment after Sarah finished, and she felt a spike of panic. Had she failed completely? But then the applause began, starting slowly but building to a standing ovation. During the question and answer session, several renowned scholars asked Sarah detailed questions about her methodology. She answered each one clearly and confidently, surprised to find that she knew her material well enough to respond without hesitation. One elderly professor from Germany told her that her work represented a paradigm shift in how scholars could approach musical analysis. After the presentation, Sarah was surrounded by people wanting to talk with her. Scholars from universities around the world wanted to know more about her research. Technology companies asked if she would be interested in internships or future collaboration. Music historians peppered her with questions about other disputed compositions they wanted her to analyze. Professor Holloway and Dr. Chen watched from the side of the room, both beaming with pride. Sarah had proven that her unique combination of mathematical genius and emotional awareness was not just interesting, but genuinely valuable to the academic and professional world. That evening, back in her hotel room, Sarah finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. She had stood in front of hundreds of experts and presented original research that they found compelling. She had answered their questions and earned their respect. For the first time in her life, she felt like she truly belonged somewhere. She called her mother to share what had happened. Her mother cried on the phone, overwhelmed with emotion. She told Sarah how proud she was, how amazed she was by her daughter's accomplishments. Then she said something that surprised Sarah. She apologized for not understanding sooner what made Sarah special, for trying to push her to be more normal instead of celebrating her unique way of seeing the world. Sarah felt tears running down her own cheeks, which was unusual for her. She wasn't someone who cried easily, but the combination of the day's triumph and her mother's words created an emotional release she hadn't known she needed. The next morning, Professor Holloway took Sarah out for coffee before they returned home. The professor told Sarah that she had been transformed by this experience of working together. For 3 decades, Professor Holloway had taught music the same way, looking for the same kinds of students, measuring success by the same traditional standards. But Sarah had shown her that there were other ways to understand and appreciate music. The professor had become a better teacher because of it. She was now incorporating mathematical analysis into her lessons with other students, helping them understand the theoretical foundations of the music they played. Some students loved this approach while others didn't. The months following the symposium brought significant changes to Sarah's life. Several universities reached out offering her early admission to their programs once she graduated high school. Technology companies expressed interest in having her join their research teams as an intern during summer breaks. Music foundations wanted to fund her continued research into mathematical patterns in classical compositions. Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the sudden attention and opportunities. She had gone from being an invisible student that nobody understood to someone that important institutions were competing to work with. Professor Holloway helped her navigate these offers, advising her on which opportunities aligned best with her interests and long-term goals. Dr. Chen's research project expanded significantly with Sarah as a key team member. They were now working with major orchestras and music archives around the world, applying Sarah's analytical methods to historical questions that had puzzled scholars for generations. Each week brought new discoveries and insights that generated excitement throughout the academic community. But success brought its own challenges. Sarah's schedule became increasingly demanding as she tried to balance high school classes, university research, and her continuing lessons with Professor Holloway. She slept less and worried more. The work that had once felt purely exciting now sometimes felt like pressure and obligation. One afternoon at the music hall, Sarah broke down crying during a lesson. Professor Holloway was alarmed at seeing the normally composed girl dissolve into tears. Between sobs, Sarah explained that she felt like she was drowning in expectations. Everyone wanted something from her. Everyone had plans for her future. She didn't know anymore what she actually wanted for herself. Professor Holloway sat beside Sarah on the piano bench and put a gentle hand on her shoulder. She told Sarah that this was a crisis that many talented young people faced when their gifts were recognized by the wider world. Success could become its own kind of trap, with other people's expectations replacing your own genuine interests and desires. The professor asked Sarah to think back to when she first made her discoveries about music and mathematics. What had motivated her then? What had made the work feel meaningful? Sarah thought about it and realized that back then she had been driven purely by curiosity. She found patterns that fascinated her and wanted to understand them better. There had been no pressure, no audience, just the joy of discovery. Professor Holloway suggested that Sarah needed to reconnect with that original motivation. She recommended that Sarah take a break from all her commitments for a few weeks. No research obligations, no presentations, no pressure to produce results. Just time to remember why she cared about this work in the first place. Sarah was initially resistant to this idea. She had deadlines and people depending on her. But Professor Holloway was firm. Burnout was a real danger, and it would be far more damaging in the long run than taking a brief pause now. The professor personally contacted Dr. Chen and explained the situation. He understood immediately and agreed that Sarah needed time to recover. During her break, Sarah did something she hadn't done in months. She played piano just for herself, with no analytical purpose and no one listening. She chose pieces she found beautiful and played them imperfectly, but with genuine feeling. It reminded her of that concert with Professor Holloway, where she had first understood that music could touch something deeper than intellect. She also spent time with her mother, who took time off work to be with her daughter. They went to movies, cooked meals together, and talked about things that had nothing to do with mathematics or music. Sarah's mother shared stories from her own youth, including dreams she had once had that she never pursued. It made Sarah realize that her mother carried her own regrets and disappointments, her own complicated relationship with ambition and normalcy. One evening, Sarah's mother told her something important. She admitted that when she first enrolled Sarah in piano lessons, she had been trying to fix something she saw as wrong with her daughter. Sarah's intense focus on mathematics and lack of interest in typical teenage activities had worried her. She had hoped that music lessons would help Sarah become more like other kids. But now Sarah's mother understood that she had been wrong. There was nothing wrong with Sarah. She was different, but different didn't mean broken. Her unique way of seeing the world was actually a gift, something to be celebrated rather than corrected. The mother apologized for not recognizing this sooner, for making Sarah feel like she needed to change to be acceptable. Sarah hugged her mother tightly, feeling a knot of tension she hadn't known she was carrying finally release. She realized that much of her anxiety about success and expectations came from a deep-seated fear, that she was fundamentally flawed, that any achievement was just temporarily covering up the weird, difficult person she really was. Her mother's acceptance meant more than any academic recognition could. After 2 weeks, Sarah returned to her work with a clearer perspective. She met with Dr. Chen and explained that she needed to restructure her involvement in the research project. She would continue contributing, but on a more limited schedule that allowed her to maintain balance in her life. Dr. Chen not only agreed but thanked her for being honest about her limits. He shared his own stories of burning out early in his career and the lessons he had learned about sustainable work practices. Sarah also made decisions about her future. After considering all the early admission offers from prestigious universities, she chose to stay in her hometown for her undergraduate education. The local state university had a solid mathematics program and was close to Professor Holloway and the music hall where their collaboration had begun. It wasn't the most prestigious option, but it felt right for her. This decision surprised many people who thought Sarah should aim for the most elite institutions possible. But Professor Holloway understood completely. Sarah was prioritizing relationships and personal growth over status and prestige. That took wisdom beyond her years. Back at the music hall, Sarah's lessons with Professor Holloway evolved once again. They spent less time on formal instruction and more on exploring ideas together. Sometimes they analyzed compositions mathematically. Other times they simply played music together, with the professor on piano and Sarah attempting various other instruments with varying degrees of success and much laughter. Professor Holloway introduced Sarah to her other students, young musicians who were pursuing traditional performance paths. Sarah was initially intimidated by their natural musical abilities, but she discovered that they were equally intimidated by her mathematical genius. The professor organized small group sessions where Sarah would explain the theoretical foundations of pieces the other students were learning, while they would help Sarah develop better technique and emotional expression. These interactions were transformative for everyone involved. The traditional music students gained a deeper appreciation for the mathematical elegance underlying the pieces they performed. Sarah learned to appreciate musical intuition and emotional intelligence as forms of knowledge that were equally valid to analytical reasoning. They pushed each other to grow in unexpected directions. One of Professor Holloway's advanced students, a talented cellist named Marcus, became friends with Sarah. He was the first person her age who seemed genuinely interested in both her work and her as a person. They started spending time together outside of the music hall, getting coffee and talking about everything from music theory to their fears about the future. Marcus helped Sarah see that she didn't have to choose between being analytical and being emotional, between her gift for mathematics and her growing appreciation for the subjective beauty of art. A person could be complex and contradictory, interested in multiple things that seemed incompatible on the surface. That was what made people interesting. Sarah also learned about Marcus's own struggles. He was under enormous pressure from his parents to become a professional musician, but he secretly loved literature and wanted to study creative writing. He felt trapped by his talent, worried that pursuing his real interests would disappoint everyone who believed in his musical future. Sarah encouraged Marcus to be honest with his parents and Professor Holloway about his feelings. She shared her own experience of learning that success meant different things to different people, and that the opinions of others couldn't define your own path. Marcus eventually found the courage to have that difficult conversation with his family. And while it was challenging, it opened up possibilities he hadn't imagined. Through helping Marcus, Sarah realized how much she had grown since those early piano lessons. She had started as a girl who saw the world only through the lens of mathematical certainty, who was uncomfortable with emotions and human complexity. Now she was someone who could navigate ambiguity, who understood that logic and feeling were both essential parts of a full life. Professor Holloway watched these developments with deep satisfaction. Her initial test with the out-of-tune piano had been meant to reveal what Sarah lacked. Instead, it had set in motion a journey that revealed what she had all along. Not just mathematical genius, but the capacity for growth, emotional depth, and genuine wisdom. Sarah's final year of high school arrived with a mixture of anticipation and nostalgia. The girl who had reluctantly walked into the music hall almost 2 years ago was gone, replaced by a young woman who understood herself and her place in the world with remarkable clarity. She continued her research work, her lessons with Professor Holloway, and her friendship with Marcus, but now with a sense of balance she had fought hard to achieve. The university research project had produced groundbreaking results that were changing how scholars approached music analysis. Sarah's methods were being adopted by institutions around the world. She had co-authored several academic papers that were being cited by researchers decades older than her. Dr. Chen often joked that Sarah had accomplished more in 2 years than most PhD students managed in 5, but Sarah's greatest contribution went beyond her specific discoveries. She had demonstrated that there were untapped ways of understanding music that combined rigorous analytical thinking with genuine emotional awareness. She had shown that being different, thinking differently, wasn't a limitation but potentially a profound advantage. Professor Holloway decided to organize a special event to celebrate everything that Sarah had achieved. She arranged a small concert at the music hall where Sarah would present both her research and a personal piano performance. Invitations went out to Sarah's mother, Dr. Chen, and his research team, the music students Sarah had worked with, and select members of the academic community who had followed her work. The idea of performing in front of an audience terrified Sarah. She had become comfortable presenting research findings, But actually playing piano while people watched felt like exposing a vulnerable part of herself. Professor Holloway assured her that this vulnerability was precisely the point. Real art required taking emotional risks. Sarah spent weeks preparing for the concert. She chose to perform 3 pieces that represented different stages of her journey. First, the Bach prelude she had learned early in her lessons, which she would play with the mechanical precision that had once been her only approach. Second, the Satie gymnopédie that had first taught her about emotional expression in music. And finally, an original composition she had created using her mathematical understanding of musical structure, combined with her growing emotional awareness. The original composition had been Professor Holloway's idea. She challenged Sarah to use everything she had learned to create something entirely new. Sarah had been hesitant at first, doubting her ability to compose anything worthwhile. But once she started, the process became addictive. She found herself crafting melodies based on mathematical patterns, then adjusting them based on the emotional response she wanted to evoke. It was like solving an equation where half the variables were logical and half were feelings. The night of the concert arrived. The music hall was filled with people who had been part of Sarah's journey in various ways. Her mother sat in the front row, clutching a handkerchief nervously. Marcus sat with the other music students, offering Sarah an encouraging smile. Dr. Chen and his team occupied several rows, eager to see this different side of their young colleague. Professor Holloway introduced the evening by telling the story of Sarah's first lesson. She described her own initial assessment of Sarah as someone with no musical talent whatsoever. She confessed to deliberately leaving the piano out of tune as a test, expecting the girl to never notice or care. The audience laughed at the professor's admission, and Sarah felt some of her nervousness dissolve. The professor then spoke seriously about what Sarah had taught her over the past 2 years. She explained how this supposedly unmusical girl had forced her to reconsider everything she thought she knew about talent, about teaching, and about the nature of music itself. She described how their unlikely partnership had enriched both of their lives in unexpected ways. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she walked to the microphone with surprisingly steady hands. She thanked everyone who had supported her journey, especially her mother for enrolling her in lessons even though Sarah had resisted, and Professor Holloway for seeing potential where it didn't look like talent should be. Sarah then did something that surprised everyone. She asked the audience to close their eyes for a moment and just listen to the piano. She played a single note, held it until it faded, then asked people what they had heard. Some said they heard a sound. Others said they heard a tone or a pitch. A few said they heard something beautiful or melancholic. Sarah explained that all these answers were correct. A single piano note was simultaneously a physical vibration, a mathematical frequency, an aesthetic experience, and an emotional trigger. Music existed at the intersection of all these dimensions. Her journey had been about learning to experience all of them at once, to appreciate both the mathematical elegance and the emotional power of music. She sat down at the piano and began her performance. The Bach prelude came first, played with technical perfection but deliberately without emotional expression. It sounded exactly like it had during her early lessons, like a computer rendering of music. The audience listened politely, not quite sure what to make of it. Then Sarah played the same piece again, but this time with feeling. She let herself respond emotionally to the pattern she was creating, allowing vulnerability and expression to color her performance. The difference was striking. It was the same notes in the same order, but now it sounded like music created by a human being for other human beings. The gymnopédie followed, and Sarah poured everything she had learned about emotional expression into it. She thought about loneliness and beauty, about the bittersweet nature of growth and change. Her fingers moved across the keys with newfound confidence, creating sounds that resonated with the audience in ways that had nothing to do with technical precision. Finally came her original composition. She had titled it simply Equations and Emotions. The piece began with a mathematical pattern, a sequence of notes derived from the Fibonacci series. But gradually, emotion crept into the structure, bending the strict mathematical rules to create something more human and unpredictable. The composition moved between order and chaos, logic and feeling, creating a musical argument that resolved in a synthesis of both approaches. As Sarah played the final notes, the music hall fell completely silent. Then the audience erupted in applause. People stood, some wiping tears from their eyes. Sarah looked up from the piano, startled by the intensity of the response. She had done it. She had communicated something real through music, something that touched people in ways words and equations never could. After the performance, Sarah was surrounded by well-wishers. Her mother hugged her tightly, crying with pride. Marcus congratulated her and whispered that her composition was genuinely brilliant. Dr. Chen shook her hand formally and told her that watching her play had given him new insights into their research work, but the most meaningful moment came when Professor Holloway approached. The older woman looked at Sarah with eyes that held both pride and a hint of sadness. She told Sarah that she had nothing left to teach her. Sarah had found her own unique path through the world of music, one that honored both her analytical genius and her emotional depth. Sarah felt tears forming in her own eyes. She told Professor Holloway that the lessons wouldn't end just because the teaching was done. They would continue exploring music together as colleagues and friends, learning from each other as they always had. The professor smiled and agreed, recognizing the truth in Sarah's words. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Sarah stood alone for a moment at the grand piano. She pressed a single key, listening as the note filled the empty hall. She thought about that first lesson, about the out-of-tune string that had started everything. That small imperfection had revealed something important about both her and Professor Holloway. It had been a test, but not the kind either of them had expected. Professor Holloway had tested Sarah's musical awareness and found it lacking. But in the process, she had discovered something far more interesting, a mind that could perceive music in completely new ways. Sarah had passed a test she didn't know she was taking by noticing the out-of-tune note immediately, even though she lacked traditional musical training, and Sarah had tested Professor Holloway too, though not intentionally. By being so different from the students the professor was used to teaching, Sarah had challenged her to grow, to question her assumptions, and to recognize that there were multiple valid ways to understand and appreciate music. The out-of-tune piano string had been meant to expose weakness. Instead, it had revealed strength. It had been meant to prove that Sarah didn't belong in a music classroom. Instead, it had demonstrated that she belonged there in ways nobody had imagined. Sarah closed the piano lid gently and picked up her things. As she walked out of the music hall into the cool evening air, she thought about her future. She would study mathematics in college, continue her research into the mathematical foundations of music, and probably make more discoveries that surprised people. But she would also keep playing piano, keep attending concerts, keep allowing herself to experience the emotional power of music alongside its mathematical beauty. She had learned that genius wasn't about being good at just one thing.